How can we know that there's an external world around us? How can I know that I'm having this conversation in an external world and we're not just brains in a vat, or we're not just in a simulation like the Matrix?
What is knowledge?
Knowledge is defined in terms of 3 key ingredients.
Courage is accommodating a certain amount of risk.
Who is someone you admire for their intellectual courage?
If you think or if you act in a courageous way and there doesn't seem to be any risk to you, it seems hard to explain what's courageous about the act. It might be admirable, it might be praiseworthy for other reasons, but it doesn't seem to be exactly courageous. So having the courage to take the leap involving uncertainty when the facts in the world can't really tell you anything more, take the leap and put that into action.
There's the line between someone creating conspiracy theories versus someone that's genuinely being a skeptic and trying to find truth.
And if the evidence pointed towards a different conclusion, they would have drawn the conclusion that would have been identical to the evidence. Conspiracy theorists, by contrast, aren't necessarily guided by the truth and by evidence.
How do you rate the school system?
If you're not asking questions, or if you're not being encouraged to ask questions, then the chances of kind of cultivating curiosity become harder.
Part of your research is on deepfakes.
Yeah.
How do you think a government should tackle this?
To imagine that you're driving through the countryside, you look out the window of the car, the countryside is filled with all these barns, and the person you're traveling with says, oh, there's a barn, there's another barn, there's another barn. But as it transpires, this last barn that you pointed at, this was the only real barn in an environment that was just otherwise full of barn facades. One way of kind of manifesting like this indifference to the truth is by bullshitting. Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, has this very neat account of bullshit as a philosophical term. You aren't concerned about whether, what you say is kind of grounded in the truth, rather your intentions are to kind of mislead others about your intentions.
If you had to summarize your mission statement for your life in one sentence, what would that sentence be?
Be nice.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Wandering Thoughts. Today I'm joined by Dr. Taylor Matthews. So, Dr. Matthews, you are a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Southampton. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of work and expertise.
I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at Southampton. I work on the Ethics of Doubt project, based out of the university and led by Professor Søren. My role on the project is mainly in epistemology, so that's the theory of knowledge. So looking at belief formation, looking at inquiry, looking at, in particular, the role that certain character traits or certain intellectual character traits can play in facilitating good inquiry and those that impede inquiry, things like closed-mindedness, dogmatism, intellectual cowardice, and so on. And the project in general is looking at the role that things like courage can play in how we acquire knowledge and how we retain knowledge in the face of adversity, drawing on lessons from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm. And how did you become interested in this particular area of expertise? Talk to us through your journey in general. So from your undergraduate to where you are now and how your interests developed and the reasons behind them.
Yeah, my philosophical journey really started quite indirectly. So I didn't study philosophy as an undergraduate. I actually studied politics, and by studying politics, I was introduced to political philosophy, political theory, and through that, I then did a master's degree in political theory, and then through that, I then came across work in social epistemology and on what's now called epistemic injustice. This is to do with undue credibility deflations of people's testimony on the basis of things like prejudice. So getting introduced to social epistemology led me to think about things like epistemic injustice and how our communication with each other can break down, and how cultivating certain traits of character can help repair those methods of communication. And I've always been interested in how things can go wrong with these things. Lots of the work in epistemology has mostly been focused on the positives, on good belief formation, on warrant justification, and less so on things like beliefs not being justified or unwarranted and so on. So that led me into my PhD, where I looked at this phenomenon called epistemic corruption, which is essentially the idea that many of our social environments, so you think of things from schools to workplaces, can encourage what are called intellectual vices. So these are traits of character, attitudes, or dispositions in general. Or can reflect some kind of poor motivations on the behalf of people, say not being motivated to care about the truth, or being comfortable with not thinking through problems in a conscientious way. And my thesis at my PhD looked at the kind of environments that can encourage these intellectual character vices, and how we can ameliorate those environments, how we can make them better. So it set out a kind of a theory of epistemic corruption, and in doing so is aimed at a kind of not only a pedagogical resource for how we can counteract the development of intellectual vices in schooling and education, but also just in general and philosophically kind of hugging a conceptual lacuna, as it were, about the ways in which character development can go wrong.
Mm-hmm. So people can follow us. I think it's good if you gave us the definition of epistemology, and perhaps also talk a little bit about the subcategories. So you mentioned social epistemology,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and you also mentioned epistemic injustice and epistemic corruption, which seem to be central to your work. So, yes, tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So epistemology is a branch of philosophy that really, in essence, studies things relating to the truth, to knowledge, and to related concepts. So it's often called the theory of knowledge. But it doesn't just focus on knowledge, it focuses on really beliefs, justification, evidence, and inquiry. So just as ethics, I might ask questions like, what should we do? What's the right act? Epistemologists will ask, how should we form our beliefs? When should we suspend judgment? What role does evidence play in the formation of our beliefs? And it also looks at things like skepticism. So how can we know that there's an external world around us? How can I know that I'm having this conversation in an external world, and we're not just brains in a vat, or we're not just in a simulation like the Matrix? So epistemologists grapple with complex questions like that. And that's the core of epistemology, is looking at beliefs, inquiry, and increasingly looking at the role of agencies, looking at us as humans, how we can, how our own agency can shape our beliefs, and how we interact with evidence. Epistemic injustice, as I mentioned, is a topic in social epistemology. So at least since Descartes in the 17th century, and even earlier, much epistemology was really focused on belief formation in isolation from people. So Descartes famously thinks of this, takes a very individualist standpoint about when we should, how we should try to achieve kind of certainty in our beliefs, and essentially remove lots of beliefs and test our basic assumptions in isolation with others. And only in the past 40 years has there been more of a social shift in epistemology to looking at kind of key topics in how we should study knowledge. So things like testimony is a big issue in social epistemology, and it's obviously a key source of how we acquire much of our knowledge is testimonial based knowledge. So that's one of the key areas of social epistemology. And epistemic injustice is concerned with testimony in our testimonial exchanges. So before I get onto that, it's maybe just worth noting what epistemic means.
Mhm.
So epistemic means roughly truth-related, coming from the Greek term kind of episteme, epistemic. So the truth or knowledge related, and it's often used interchangeably with intellectual. So it's just saying that there's a kind of injustice that is related to truth-related considerations. So epistemic injustice really has two main forms, one of which is mainly testimonial in content. So it affects and it revolves around our testimonial exchanges. And specifically, it occurs when identity prejudice, so prejudice against somebody's identity, say their sexuality, their gender, their race, infiltrates one's credibility assessments of that speaker. And in virtue of that, you deflate your interlocutor's credibility on the basis of that prejudice. And that's an instance of what Miranda Fricker coined the term testimonial injustice in her groundbreaking book in 2007, Epistemic Injustice. So it's an injustice against somebody in their capacity as a knower, as somebody trying to give you knowledge, and as you as somebody who would uptake their knowledge. And because you deflate their credibility unfairly because of the identity prejudice, it's an instance of a distinctly epistemic sort of injustice. And there's also another kind of injustice that Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice. And this is less so to do with testimonial exchanges, but more to do with our shared concepts. So how we create concepts.
That's
fire
good.
alarm.
That's good. That's good.
So it's about our shared concepts and how we build them. So a key example that she uses is of sexual harassment. So prior to the coining of sexual harassment as a concept, many women in the 1960s and 70s in particular, when it was quite in the spotlight, but obviously far further back in the past, had difficulties expressing their experiences around men most of the time, and it was not something that was intelligible to people. And until the term sexual harassment was coined, people were dismissed. That what they said about people was dismissed because there was no way of understanding what was going on to them, what were their experiences, what was happening to them. And so hermeneutical injustice is an injustice not done to one in virtue of being a speaker, but it's a structural kind of injustice. It's not being prevented from contributing to what's called a shared pool of conceptual resources. So you're prevented from actually contributing to the kind of dominant concepts in society, like things like sexual harassment, such as marital rape. These are concepts that weren't really in existence and didn't exist until they're being coined. And so hermeneutical injustices are more of a structural phenomenon as opposed to the testimonial-based versions. So that's epistemic injustice in a nutshell. Would you like me to talk about epistemic corruption?
Yes, please.
So epistemic corruption, again, is based on the work by Ian James Kidd at the University of Nottingham. And it comes in two broad types. One way of thinking about epistemic injustice is by thinking about just an ordinary social environment, as I mentioned, things like schools, workplaces. And one kind of corrupting environment is where the environment fails to facilitate the development of so-called intellectual character virtues. So things like open-mindedness, intellectual diligence, intellectual courage, intellectual humility. These are the traits that make us good thinkers. They aid our inquiries. They help us process and handle evidence. And an environment that kind of prevents these traits from being developed is passively corrupting. It makes it harder to cultivate these excellences of character. So that's one way of that for an environment to be epistemically corrupting, is to prevent the development of these intellectual virtues. So these dispositions that make us better thinkers, excellent thinkers, as it were. And there's another version which is an active variant. So active epistemic corruption is less so about failing to cultivate these virtues in certain environments, but where these environments actively undermine their development, but actually encourage the development of intellectual vices. So things like closed-mindedness, dogmatism, intellectual arrogance. And some environments are better at encouraging these traits of character than others, and they'll be more epistemically corrupting in virtue of that. So the phenomenon is really a way of understanding how it is that we become intellectually vicious, or how we become bad thinkers, how our environments can corrupt us as inquirers.
So I want to ask you about the characteristics of an environment that make it epistemically corrupted, and also what is a healthy environment that you wouldn't characterize as epistemically corrupted. Before we go to this, I want to also ask you a silly sounding question, but since we're talking about definitions, what is knowledge?
Well, that's quite. That's not a silly question at all. It's a very good question. There are in epistemology, there's intense debate about what exactly knowledge is, how we should understand knowledge. For the most part, knowledge is defined in terms of three key ingredients, and there's then various differences between how you cash out those three ingredients. So at the least, it's widely regarded that to know something, to have knowledge, is to believe something. So if I know that there's a chair next to me, it's generally the case that I believe that there's a chair here. So that's one ingredient. The other is that knowledge is so-called factive. Yeah, it has to be true. So that corresponds to kind of facts in the world. So you can't have false knowledge. That wouldn't be an instance of knowledge. So the second ingredient is truth. You need a true belief for something to count as knowledge. But that is not enough still. You need a third and final ingredient, which is justification or warrant. So your beliefs need to be justified or warranted. And there's considerable debate in contemporary epistemology as to how you understand justification and warrant. But those three ingredients were for a long time the kind of dominant way of understanding knowledge. And then in the 1960s, a philosopher called Edmund Gettier came along and showed decisively that this simple tripartite analysis of knowledge was wrong. And he came up with a number of cases in which a person has a justified, a true belief, but doesn't amount to knowledge. So one case that Gettier talks about is imagining a colleague who is in Barcelona. You believe they're in Barcelona, and another colleague who you think owns a Ford car. And your belief is justified, and it turns out true, that these are the case. But it's just a matter of luck, really, that these two things happen, that somebody is in, your colleague is in Barcelona, and the other colleague owns a Ford. So Gettier showed that you can have cases of justified true belief that fall short of knowledge. And in the decades since, the 1960s, since the publication of his famous paper, there's been considerable debate as to what knowledge is. But general consensus is that it at least requires truth, belief, and justification. And that's I think how many people how would commonsensically understand knowledge is you kind of think it's going to be true. It's going to be true. You've got to have good evidence, or it's got to be reasonable or justified, and you believe it, or you at least can represent it mentally in some way. So that's the kind of basic definition of knowledge: is it's justified true belief plus something else, some so-called anti-Gettier condition. So kind of an anti-luck condition. You can't have lucky knowledge, as it were. Luck seems to exclude knowledge. You can't have like a lucky guess. Doesn't count as knowledge.
How do we acquire knowledge?
There are many ways of acquiring knowledge. So I've already mentioned some along the way. So testimonial knowledge is a key source of knowledge. And so when we talk to people, it's generally regarded that we know what somebody says if they tell us that. So in epistemology, there is debate about testimonial knowledge, whether testimonial knowledge is something that we can just take as a kind of primary source of knowledge, or whether it actually reduces to another source of knowledge, like you have to infer that your speaker is reliable, or so on. So there's debate in epistemology about whether about the nature and the epistemic place of testimony as a basic source of knowledge. Some people think it is a basic source of knowledge, and some other people think that you have to have other reasons, like good reasons, to know that your informant is reliable, say, or another source is perception, so sense perception, so vision, memory, hearing. There's also introspection as well, so kind of conscious inward reflection, thinking about things introspectively. Then there's also just reasoning as well, so deductive reasoning. If this is the case and something else is the case, then you can deduce from these two things that something else must be the case. So there's deduction, induction, so inferential reasoning, inferring things on the basis of other things. They're the main sources of knowledge.
Why is it important to study epistemology today?
Yeah, great question. I think with the way the world is currently and the way that it's increasingly shaping up, it's important to be able to navigate those pitfalls, especially things like misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. And by studying epistemology, you get a basic understanding of how to conduct yourself in a good way, intellectually speaking. So you learn the importance of justification for beliefs. You learn about how to conduct inquiries well. And along the way, you also just learn about very interesting topics in their own right, such as skepticism, such as the analysis of knowledge, things that haven't got an immediate bearing on society, but just interesting in and of themselves. So it's just an interesting topic for anybody who's interested in the world around us, making sense of the world, challenging assumptions. The assumption that we do exist and that we're not in a simulation, we're not in the matrix. This is a key question that epistemologists grapple with is skepticism. How do we know that we are not in the matrix? So there's just theoretical questions that are just sort of in general interest, and then there's particular questions that are of kind of social interest as well, like combating misinformation, disinformation, and these have come to the fore in recent years.
So right now you're, from my understanding, working on the ethics of doubt project.
Yes.
And you're learning about the relationship between virtue, epistemology, skepticism, conspiracy theories. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. So the core of the project is centered around the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And he has this long, very, very dense volume called Concluding Unscientific Postscript, and various other works. But mostly in this work, he makes this connection between lacking courage and the role of kind of fearlessness or intrepidity, and this is a key concept in his work, the leap. And so the project is centered around the role that is the kind of courage, having the courage to believe, and what that entails. And courage has an intellectual form. So when we think of, you might think of being amongst a group of friends, and they have a certain opinion, and they kind of question you on your beliefs. And one option in that situation might be to follow the crowd and to kind of go with the herd mentality. And another might be to kind of stick to your guns and to try to defend your position, even if there's a possibility that you might be wrong, or there might be other kind of social implications of you holding those beliefs. And this is where intellectual courage comes in. And intellectual courage is an intellectual virtue. So it's an excellence of intellectual character that makes us a better inquirer. It helps us acquire things like the truth and knowledge and understanding. And the project is trying to take these themes from virtue epistemology, which is this really quite popular field, subfield in epistemology today that focuses not just on kind of beliefs in the abstract, but actually on inquirers, on people. So on the role that these intellectual virtues, these features of one's character, features of one's cognition, how they can contribute to knowledge, us acquire the truth. And the main idea really is to try and to apply these lessons from virtue epistemology to not just other kind of aspects within virtue epistemology, but also how to understand conspiracy theories as well. So what's going on in conspiracy theorizing? Is it that those who entertain conspiracy theories lack a kind of intellectual courage? Are they intellectually cowardly in not being able to kind of face off to uncertainty in the world? Do they
appeal to conspiracy theories as a means of trying to grapple with some kind of certainty or uncertainty, a kind of safety blanket, as it were. So we're trying to look at the connections between the intellectual virtues and conspiracy theorizing. And in the middle, this is the topic of skepticism. So when you think of a conspiracy theorist, and you could take your favorite conspiracy theory, be it 9/11, Truther, or QAnon, or whatever, they're going to be skeptical of the kind of dominant or the authority, the mainstream narrative. In other words, they're going to either disbelieve that the majority narrative is correct, or they're going to suspend judgment. So they're not going to form a belief in favor of that. They're not going to disbelieve it either. They're just going to be agnostic and suspend judgment. And so we're trying to also explore the connection between skepticism, this kind of skepticism that seems to be prevalent in much conspiracy theorizing, with intellectual courage. So can intellectual courage not only help us acquire knowledge, but also can help us live?
What characteristics make someone have intellectual courage?
Sorry, say that again?
What characteristics make someone have intellectual courage?
Yeah, good. So one way of thinking about intellectual courage is to start with kind of just courage, kind of ordinary courage. And that comes to us mostly in the moral domain. So we think of just being a courageous person is maybe standing up to others in the face of fear, or in the face of risks. And then we can build an account of intellectual courage off of that. And that's what we tend to do in epistemology. And in fact, what many virtue epistemologists do when they're constructing their accounts of intellectual virtue, they look to the work of Aristotle, who provides rich source material for looking at how to cultivate moral virtues, and they apply it to these intellectual virtues. So in the intellectual domain, being courageous is typically thought of as pursuing certain lines of inquiry in the face of dangers to oneself. So often the paradigm exemplar of intellectual courage is maybe an investigative journalist who is investigating maybe corruption at a certain company, or trying to uncover some hard truths that are maybe being concealed by a corporation or something along those lines. And they do so because they care about these truths and the knowledge, but they're also aware that it carries maybe significant costs to themselves. And those can be social, it can be moral costs, but they can also be intellectual costs, intellectual risks. So you might pursue these inquiries, even though there's a chance you could form false beliefs, you could go wrong. So the characteristics of
having a certain motivational profile, so you're
to pursue things like knowledge, truth, understanding, perhaps for their own sake, or for maybe the sake of some other end. You have to usually kind of feel. There's an affective dimension to intellectual courage, so you have to feel. You might feel distressed by the fact that this information is being hidden, and you want to uncover it. There's also the behavioral dimension. So the intellectually courageous person doesn't just sit there in their chair. They go out and they try to uncover things, or they will form certain beliefs in the face of adversity. in the face of maybe opposition, and they'll stick to those beliefs and try to.
Then there's also knowing a kind of judgmental aspect to it as well. So kind of knowing when to deploy this intellectual courage, when
when the situation is right, when it's called for. So there are these kind of broadly four main characteristics of intellectual courage, and that goes really for any kind of analysis of an intellectual character trait that is inherited from an Aristotelian framework. It has, it's a motivational component, an affective component, a competence or behavioural component, and the component of judgment, kind of judging when to having the good judgment to deploy that in the right situations at the right time.
Who is someone you admire for their intellectual courage?
Oh, good question. Yeah. I think so. Here's a popular example that comes to mind. Maybe I'm not sure whether it would be my number one, but I think they're an interesting case study. Is somebody like Aaron Brockovich. So I don't know if you're familiar with the case of Aaron Brockovich in the film, as a lawyer trying to uncover this kind of corruption in the US with this. I think it's a water company who are kind of contaminating water, and lots of residents get ill and pass away. She is somebody who exemplified intellectual courage and moral courage by pursuing her inquiries in the face of threats, in the face of adversity, in the face of conflict and risk to herself and to her own standing, in order to try to spread awareness and get this information that was being suppressed.
Perfect. The audio is back. Sorry, I lost the last 5-10 seconds, but you mentioned a great example about if you want to just finish that segment.
Yeah, sorry. So Aaron Brockovich would be an example of intellectual courage. Somebody who pursued her inquiries into the shady dealings of companies in the USA, trying to get information, knowledge into the public domain at great risk to herself and to those around her. So an exemplar of moral and intellectual courage.
So you mentioned skepticism and conspiracy theory. My dad studied maths and statistics at the university, and he wanted me to ask you, I'm also curious, how do we distinguish between someone that's trained to doubt something and to seek for evidence in order to come towards the truth versus conspiratorial doubt? So where's the line between someone creating conspiracy theories versus someone that's genuinely being a skeptic and trying to find truth?
Yeah, good. So there's a nice distinction in the literature between theorizing about a conspiracy on the one hand, and then conspiracy theorizing on the other. And what that distinction really amounts to is that, exactly what you just said there are some people who pursue inquiries because they suspect that there is something shady afoot, and they want to bring that to light. And then there are other people who seem to be doing something similar, but we are far more reluctant to kind of admire their behavior. We're far more willing to condemn them and to criticize them. And it's a fine line to tread in some cases, but here's one way of delineating the two. So think of something like, think of a conspiracy that happened, like Watergate scandal in the 1970s. So those who were working, the journalists, those who uncovered the Watergate scandal, that was an instance of a conspiracy where the evidence pointed towards it and was being suppressed. So it's an instance of theorizing about conspiracy. So the journalists who were kind of working on this, they were guided by the evidence. They were guided by the truth and other epistemic considerations, so things like knowledge and understanding. And that meant that wherever these things took them, they would follow.
Mhm.
So imagine if the truth, the evidence actually didn't point towards Nixon, or it pointed towards something, a different conclusion, they would have drawn the conclusion that would have been identical to the evidence,
Mhm.
based on the evidence. Conspiracy theorists, by contrast, aren't necessarily guided by the truth and by evidence. Rather, there are probably other factors at play. Probably there might be practical factors, so a sense of belonging in one's in-group, a kind of fear of being excluded or being an outcast. And there are differences in how they process and just handle things like evidence. So take an example such as QAnon and think of an echo chamber. So an online echo chamber would be somewhere that the members kind of actively distrust those outside of it, and certain views are reinforced. And within those echo chambers, what usually happens, or what might happen, is that those who engage in conspiracy theorizing insulate those beliefs. What they do is that any counter evidence is used to reinforce the conspiracy theory. So, for example, if somebody is talking about how the Democrats, how Hillary Clinton are trafficking children into pizza parlors in Washington DC, and you say to them, "Well, it was shown that this people went there, they couldn't find anything. How can you think this?" And a typical response might be something like, "Well, of course they wouldn't find anything. It's been hidden." Or they set this was staged. This is all part of a conspiracy. They want to make us think as though nothing's going on. They're in on it. So any kind of information that is given to try to disprove the conspiracy or cast doubt on it is then is fed back into the conspiracy to feed it and to sustain it. These are cases of what's been called evidential self-insulation. So it's kind of a self-insulated belief. And in those cases, the conspiracy theorist comes out as somebody who kind of exhibits a kind of irrationality. They're not really responsive to the truth, whereas somebody who is actually genuinely trying to uncover evidence, like an Erin Brockovich, like those who worked the Watergate scandal, they were generally concerned with the truth, and had the truth pointed elsewhere, they would have followed it. Whereas a conspiracy theorist is less willing to go down the route of the truth. That's not to say that they never do. So an interesting example that I only found out about recently is it concerns flat earthers. So the flat earth conspiracy theory is another kind of very popular conspiracy theory that kind of, the name speaks for itself. And a group of flat earth theorists organized a trip to Antarctica to try to show that the world was flat, the Earth was flat, and in the process of doing the experiments, they would it came to light that actually the light would curve in such a way that would kind of show that it wouldn't happen if the Earth were flat. The way the light shone, it wouldn't have happened, and lots of key figures in that movement, or at least a handful, actually were receptive to that evidence and abandoned, or at least became slightly unhappier about holding on to the belief that the Earth was flat. So there are some cases where conspiracy theories they are kind of confronted with, evidence that's just insurmountably against them. But other cases that distinguish the conspiracy theorists from those who are kind of trying to uncover conspiracies is that they will try to weaponize the truth in favor of their theory and insulate the theory.
No, that's a really good example. So what are you currently working on right now?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things on the go currently. One is directly related to the project, and it's on the relationship between knowledge and courage. So I think I alluded to it earlier that knowledge seems to be incompatible with luck. You can't have a lucky guess; doesn't count as knowledge. You can't. There's an interesting kind of paradox in epistemology, kind of a lottery paradox, which is, in a nutshell, the idea that you can't know that you're going to lose a fair lottery. So if you buy a ticket, despite the astronomical odds of you not winning, it seems wrong to say that, well, I know I'm going to lose the lottery. And this speaks to the role of luck in kind of precluding us from knowing things. And the flip side of that is the relationship between luck and risk. So luck is this kind of like backwards looking phenomenon. So if it was lucky that you survived a shot from a sniper, it implies that this could have happened to you at some point in the past. And risk is the flip side of that. So risk is a kind of like future-looking phenomenon. But if you were at risk of being shot by a sniper's bullet, but you weren't, it kind of implies that this is something that could have happened to you at there and now. And so just as luck is taken to be incompatible with knowledge, a certain kind of luck anyway, so too is risk. And this piece of work I'm working on is looking at the relationship between distinctly kind of epistemic kind of risk, so the risk of forming false beliefs, and knowledge, and intellectual courage, because it seems that quite central to an intellectual form of courage is accommodating a certain amount of risk. So if you think, or if you act in a courageous way and there doesn't seem to be any risk to you, it seems hard to explain what's courageous about the act. It might be admirable, it might be praiseworthy for other reasons, but it doesn't seem to be exactly courageous. So there seems to be this risk condition on courage. But if the likes of Kierkegaard are right that knowledge sometimes requires courage, then how do we kind of square these intuitions? This intuition that knowledge seems to be incompatible with high degrees of risk, while at the same time trying to make sense of the idea that knowledge could also require some form of courage. So the paper I'm working on is looking to kind of reconcile these 2 points about the role of risk and courage. So that's one piece of work. And other pieces of work really are continuations of what I was working on in my PhD. So they are looking more squarely at intellectual vices and how they relate to contemporary themes in epistemology. So one paper is looking at the relationship between intellectual character vices like intellectual laziness and closed-mindedness, dogmatism, and another species of knowledge, knowledge how, so know-how. So it's connecting these two areas. And another piece of work is looking at what's called the normativity of vice. So how should we think about things like vices what are vices? And I'm looking at an influential author's work to try to model these on incompetences. This view is a popular view in epistemology, which says that knowledge is kind of like a performance, a successful and competent performance. So it creates an analogy between knowledge and something like an archery shot. So if you imagine you're an archer and you've got your bow and arrow and you aim at the target and you shoot, the idea is that when you shoot the target and you successfully hit the target, but you not only successfully hit it, but you also hit it because of your archery competence or your archery ability, your shot is then apt. And the idea is that knowledge is identical to this kind of apt belief. So I'm trying to model intellectual vices on these kind of epistemic incompetences that we kind of find from any domain with a kind of aim or like performances in general. So you might think of like being incompetent at football or at cricket. How can we map these kind of incompetencies from the domain of performances in general to epistemology? So I'm just trying to inherit. I'm trying to expand some of the landscape in this field. So that's another project I'm working on currently.
That's fascinating. Circling back to what we were talking about in the beginning, can you describe to me an environment that we would call epistemically corrupted and one that we wouldn't? What are the characteristics?
Yeah, so epistemic corruption really it kind of comes in degrees. So there'll always be, it's a dynamic phenomenon. There's always this kind of push-pull. So some environments will be more corrupting than others. Most environments will have some corrupting tendencies. They might be hidden, or they might just only affect certain people. An example of an epistemically corrupting environment would probably be a repressive, totalitarian regime that really suppresses things like the asking of good questions, really discourages free thinking. These are probably the worst, the most epistemically corrupting environments, where it's just really difficult to cultivate things like open-mindedness, intellectual curiosity, and so on, and quite easy to cultivate dogmatism or closed-mindedness, prejudice, and so on. But obviously that's quite an extreme example. Many kind of mundane environments can be epistemically corrupting. So many school environments can be epistemically corrupting, depending on the kind of educational system at work. So think of a school that encourages students to learn by rote. So you just repeat the same process over and over again. An environment that encourages that is also at the same time going to discourage thinking outside the box, taking risks, and in doing so will be epistemically corrupting because it kind of leads to a kind of conformity of thinking and prevents students from cultivating, more open-mindedness, intellectual curiosity about things. If they know that they could just employ the same process to answer the correct questions, that's fine. There's not that willingness to think outside the box. So you can really have a sliding scale as to the kind of the extent to which an environment is corrupting. And the flip side of that is it would be kind of an ameliorative one would be an epistemically be an environment that just encourages intellectual virtues and discourages intellectual vices. So it would be an edificationist environment where we want one which is edifying. So kind of enhancing one's character trying to encourage excellence of character, and kind of ridding it of the kind of failings of character. So many environments can be corrupting, some far more than others. And one reason why the concept is useful to have is because it just allows us to identify the kind of tendencies that we might be familiar with, that we can then realize that maybe this is, encouraging a kind of closed-mindedness, or it's encouraging a kind of polarization, kind of groupthink. And then you can pinpoint those structures and mechanisms, and you can then try to rectify them, and remedy them, so that they don't have as much influence over people's intellectual conduct.
How do you rate the school system, and not only in high school but also at university? Do you feel it's epistemically corrupted? Do you feel some places are better than others?
Yeah, I think some places will no doubt be better than others. I think, it's been a long time since I was at secondary school, but I can think of instances where, you'll be given homework, and this is the way to do it, and don't deviate from this. Or there is little encouragement of asking questions. Kind of bad pedagogy. That can be epistemically corrupting if you're not able to ask questions. Asking questions is a key way of exhibiting curiosity. So if you're not asking questions, or if you're not being encouraged to ask questions, then the chances of kind of cultivating curiosity become harder. So I can definitely think of cases of schools that don't encourage that kind of behaviour. At university level, yeah, certainly. I think, especially with the kind of rise and development of AI tools, it's easier for students to become more intellectually lazy by knowing how to maybe game certain AI tools, to what kind of inputs to write, and to then kind of learn how to transpose that into an essay. And there isn't the kind of flexibility, kind of like intellectual flexibility, to not only just think outside the box, but also to take a chance on actually writing the essay, or having more fluid way of learning. So the rise of AI in education is definitely it can definitely encourage a kind of intellectual laziness, to just rely on the tools, and know how to game them and use them to one's advantage. That's I think a main worry with contemporary education that our universities are trying to grapple with. Yeah.
So how do we cultivate an environment that's healthier, then, that's not going to be epistemically corrupted?
Yeah, good. So, this is really one of the points of developing this concept of epistemic corruption, is that it allows us to pinpoint the structures and mechanisms that degrade our intellectual characters. So one way we can try to cultivate or develop these edifying environments is by looking at the kind of structures that would encourage intellectual vices, or that would at least undermine the cultivation of intellectual virtues. So as I mentioned, in secondary schooling, if a school is kind of encouraging education by rote, so just kind of like learning things over and over again, then to try to encourage more flexibility, mental flexibility, or open-mindedness, it would be a good way of starting is to remove that rote learning as a way of learning and education, and replace it with something else. That would be one way of kind of developing these epistemically edifying environments is by removing the corrupting influences. And again, some environments will be more edifying than others. They'll be kind of healthier, as it were, in virtue of having those good structures. But also at the collective level as well, having a good ethos in institutions and having people who can implement that ethos. So it's not just the kind of performative, this is what we stand for, but actually it's not actually implemented in practice. You need to have the right personnel as well, who can carry out and implement the good values. Those are probably the main things. At least what you can do on a personal level without getting too much into kind of structural changes.
Part of your research is on deepfakes.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us what deepfakes are and your research around it?
Yeah. So, deepfakes is two words really connected together. So, one hand, it's short for a deep neural network, which is a piece of artificial intelligence that is kind of like works in a similar way to how our brain does, kind of like neural networks, which pass information and generate information. So you have, at least in deepfakes, you have kind of a generator. So you have an input. So you provide the AI with material that you want to create, and it then competes. It creates information that tries to deceive it tries to deceive itself. So it has essentially two kind of components. Can't quite remember the names of them, but one tries to deceive the other by making kind of like copies, and the other tries to then find out whether it's real or not. And they compete, and in doing so, they kind of create the kind of videos and images that you see. So these deep neural networks create fakes that are highly convincing. When I first started writing about them about 3 years ago, actually longer than that, the quality of deepfakes wasn't that great. You could tell that things were deepfakes, and nowadays it's kind of scary how good they are, and each day they deceive people. The telltale signs are much harder to find. And my work on them, I have on the one hand was trying to encourage people to cultivate these kind of intellectual character virtues to help them identify deepfakes, but also not just to do that, but also to help them question kind of their online media, so the kind of videos they see. So being kind of persevering and kind of double checking your work, being conscientious, kind of caring about the truth. These kind of encouraging kind of critical thinking skills, so not taking things at face value necessarily. And then another piece of work was on a comparison between deepfakes and these cases in epistemology, which are often referred to as barn cases. And what they are is they're used as a way of showing how knowledge is incompatible with a certain kind of luck. So you're asked to imagine that you're driving through the countryside with somebody, and you look out the window of the car, and the countryside is filled with all these barns, and the person you're traveling with says, "Oh, there's a barn, there's another barn, there's another barn." But as it transpires, when they say, "Oh, this last barn you pointed at, this was the only real barn in an environment that was just otherwise full of barn facades that the owner of the farm put up to make the land more attractive to buyers," or something like that. And in those cases, actually, it would be helpful. It'd be interesting to see what you think in these cases. So, it's generally held amongst epistemologists that the person who says there's a barn, despite the fact that it was only one genuine barn amongst lots of fakes, doesn't know that that's a genuine barn. So I'd be interested to hear whether you think, if you encountered a scenario where you were looking out the window and you saw these houses and you said, "Oh, there's a house there," but it was the only one genuine house amongst lots of identical looking fakes. Whether you think that you would say, "Oh, I know that it's a barn. I know that's a house." What do you think in that case?
I'd lean towards saying that you don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I was reading through your work and I came across digital fake barns in one of your papers, and I immediately, for some reason, thought of a broken clock is right twice a day. But I think if you take it as a whole, I think in it, I think it would count as knowledge if we repeated that 100 times and you'd get it right the rest of them, or at least most of the time. But if we just stumbled across you being lucky, and you've mentioned in the podcast about epistemic luck, it seems to me that it's the same as in science. An experiment will count as valid when you can repeat it, and it's similar to that to me. Okay, you got that result in that experiment with that particular group sample, it's those particular conditions, but if it's not repeatable, then, well, how... it doesn't seem like knowledge. It doesn't seem like knowledge to me. What's the argument against this then? So someone that would argue that, no, that person actually had knowledge at that moment.
Well, the general consensus in epistemology is that the person doesn't know that it's a barn that they're looking at. So they're kind of similar to your intuitions there. The intuitions generally there is no knowledge there, for the reason that their environment is just very it's a very risky environment to form beliefs, because you could easily form false beliefs, given how close the fake barns are to what you actually see. So my argument looked at those kind of cases in epistemology and kind of scaled them up to deepfakes. My argument in this paper was that there's a worry that as deepfake development improves, we will find it hard to distinguish between genuine videos and deepfakes. So we'll reach a situation where we could be looking at a video, but it's genuine, but we could very easily look at a deepfake version of that video, and we wouldn't know. We wouldn't be entitled to know in that case. So it was really trying to take an important lesson from contemporary epistemology and apply it to the development of deepfakes. And in that paper, I draw an analogy between these two cases, which I call digital fake barns. So they are just deepfakes. And I use this example from Israel, actually, this hospital where they injected kind of tumors into these scans, and they asked radiologists to try to identify the scans with the tumors, and they were unable to detect the difference between the deepfake ones and the genuine ones. Obviously, this was just over 3 years ago, and so I think it's easy to figure out and come up with better examples nowadays of videos that look, indiscernible from genuine ones. that you could easily mistake for, the real thing. And where we might want to say, well, you don't know that, because you could have easily watched the deepfake that maybe was circulating on the internet. So he's trying to draw out a general worry for our claims to knowledge. And towards the end of that paper, I again tried to appeal to the role of these intellectual character virtues in trying to help us be more critical in thinking and checking our evidence and checking the source of the video. Because it's all too easy now to just, think, oh, it's a video, I can trust it. But kind of deepfakes, especially now, give us reason to, second think. Think, is this genuine? Like, is this person actually doing this? Yeah. So I mean, I like to think that the paper was kind of a bit pathetic. It was it was kind of looking into the future as to how the development would be and what the epistemological implications of deepfakes would be for our claims to knowledge.
So, do people have the right not to be deceived? I want us to talk a little bit around epistemic rights, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you might think just a general right not to be deceived. You might think, at least in moral philosophy and ethics, deception would be a kind of morally bad thing, at least if you come from a broadly kind of Kantian tradition. You shouldn't lie to people. You kind of undermine their autonomy as kind of rational thinking beings. And so you can extend that in epistemology as well and say, well, there is an epistemic right to not be deceived, because if you deceive somebody, you deprive them of knowledge. And you might think of knowledge as a kind of epistemic good, something that if you have an abundance of, your life is going well, generally speaking, you're flourishing as an intellectual agent. So if you deceive people systematically, at least anyway, you deprive them of that knowledge, and that could be a violation of their right. How to actually cash out that right in detail is probably a tricky question. And Lani Watson, who is an epistemologist, has a nice book called on epistemic rights. It kind of gives a nice summary of the different epistemic rights we have, and how they can be violated. So that's something I would look at if you're interested in epistemic rights. Lani Watson's book. But there would be an epistemic right to not be deceived, especially we might think it depends if you think of certain kinds of deepfakes. So many deepfakes circulated originally, and also now more as well, contain sexual content, pornographic content that harms people, putting somebody else's face on another person's body, or just kind of generating the body, would be a harm in itself, and would not only deceive audiences, but I mean the main harm there would be you're using somebody's identity in a way they didn't consent to. So the right to not be deceived, I guess, would take on a form of not only just from a purely epistemic perspective on having a right to know that this is a fake, but also a right to not harm people and use their identities for kind of nefarious ends. So lots more work needs to be done on kind of developing an account of epistemic rights. I think work on deepfakes has prompted serious consideration of this topic.
So, when it comes to policy, how do you think a government or worldwide the governments should tackle this? Should they make it really difficult to create deepfakes in the first place? That seems hard to me. Or should there be very good regulation once those deepfakes are created? We have a good system of shutting them down. I haven't formulated my question perfectly, but it reminds me a little bit of the war on drugs. It's like it seems like making it really difficult for people to take drugs hasn't worked. And my worry is that it's similar with deepfakes.
Yeah, I think that could be quite a good comparison. I think I also share worries that making it difficult to kind of create deepfakes will just push it underground, as in the case of drugs. So you just have an illicit market. You just have an illicit market of generating deepfakes and selling access to those videos. So I think a better route would be at least some kind of state regulation, or at least there's some talk of having deepfakes having watermarks so you can identify them, so creators you can identify them as deepfakes as such, so you can just see, you haven't got to check whether this is a genuine or a fake. There's a mark on the video that tells you it's AI generated. So that could be one way. The worry then is that those who create deepfakes, maybe for bad actors, could then also just generate things that look like watermarks. So they're playing cat and mouse with the producers of these videos if they're bad actors. So a role comes then in for education as well. I think just digital literacy, being able to just look at the source. So has it come from a reputable source, like a news organization? If it has, what kind of news organization? Can you verify it independently? What does the link look like? What's going on in the video? Does the movement look strange? Are there kind of some telltale signs that kind of make you wonder whether this could be real or not? So I think there'll be a role for just education generally, and like kind of critical thinking skills, information literacy in trying to tackle these. Kind of like, I guess, like drug education. Just educating people about the harms of drugs doesn't stop people from taking drugs, but it might inform them about their use or potential hazards, and then they can make up their own minds. Because that seems to me probably the only viable route, rather than driving it underground, this development of deepfakes. It'd be interesting to question as to how they develop going forward. Because originally it used to be the case that the kind of face would be superimposed on, it would just be a face kind of swapping deepfakes, or it would be the whole body, but there would be kind of dislocations in the way the body moved, and now it's all more seamless. So it would be interesting to see the next kind of development that this technology, that these kind of deep neural networks can create. So it's important that there's education around how to at least approach them, how to I guess regulate your intellectual diet. What kind of websites are you looking at your news from? How are you getting the news from? Because if they do become kind of indistinguishable from genuine videos, then of course everybody could, in theory, fall prey to watching a deepfake. But then if you rely solely on a certain diet of information, then you might be in a worse place, intellectually speaking, regarding whether your beliefs are true or not, than if you kind of mix up your intellectual diet and you kind of look at multiple different sources of information for your information news.
That's very wise. I have a few more questions to ask you around your work, and then we'll have a couple of just relaxed questions to close the episode. One thing I wanted to talk about was how deepfakes affect our epistemic character and how they corrupt it. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, around maybe the creation of cynicism and indifference and nihilism and stuff like that.
Yeah, good. So I was thinking, I think one of the main things would be a kind of cynicism. So it's just you might think that as deepfake development increases and become better, you might just become just outwardly distrustful of videos in general. And so just be cynical about the veracity of genuine videos and think, well, I can't tell. Who are we to tell whether this video is genuine or not? And so kind of just step back and take this kind of very cynical attitude towards video content. And if we think that cynicism is kind of a failing of intellectual character, or kind of an epistemic kind of cynicism, so a distrust towards kind of epistemic sources like perception, testimony, and so on, then it would be deepfakes would have this kind of epistemically corrupting effect on us, kind of encourage cynicism. Alternatively, deepfakes could also encourage a kind of intellectual dishonesty or indifference. So in the age we live in, clicks earn money. This is especially true of fake news. People purveyors of fake news oftentimes produce stories with little care for whether they're true or not, just to get the clicks, just to kind of to be top of the news feed for the more monetization. So the worry there could be that more sophisticated deepfakes are just a means to monetization, to kind of clickbait, and kind of circulating fake news. So they encourage a kind of indifference to the truth. So you're not really concerned about actually whether this content is true or not. You're just concerned with, how much money I can earn from kind of sharing some content. And if you can create sophisticated deepfakes that are quite shocking, or that are going to potentially generate lots of clicks, then that kind of the indifference to the truth is going to erode any kind of conscientiousness towards the truth, kind of actually caring about whether some statement of theirs is true or not. So that's another risk with the prevalence of deepfakes, and just with fake news, for example, in general. And deepfakes could be a good vehicle for fake news and mis and disinformation as well.
No, makes sense. I also stumbled across something else in your work that I wanted you to explain to me. So, what's non-ideal epistemology?
This is a term that I believe Robin McKenna at the University of Liverpool coined in reaction to Charles Mill's term of kind of an ideal theory. So a non-ideal epistemology is an epistemology that takes as its starting point the kind of non-ideal realities of our lives. So, for example, it kind of rejects assumptions about us being kind of infinitely, like cognitively infinite creatures. It recognizes our limitations cognitively. It looks at maybe the darker sides of our epistemic conduct, so the vices as opposed to the virtues. It looks at how our beliefs can be unjustified as opposed to justified, and it tries to create a picture of things by looking at the non-ideal side of things. So rather than looking at trying to create an ideal and aspire towards it, it looks at the way the world actually is, the non-ideal realities we face, and then it looks at how we can then go about conducting ourselves on the basis of our kind of these non-ideal realities. So that would be so a non-ideal epistemology would be a way of theorizing about knowledge, understanding, and other kind of epistemic goods from the perspective of us as kind of like limited creatures.
And what are vice-indexed skills there?
So, vice index skills, they're skills that are indexed to intellectual vices. And the reason why they're interesting is because there seem to be an assumption that just as virtues are kind of excellences, so vices are failings. That seems, true, and I wouldn't want to dispute that. But then there seems to be an inference from thinking that vices are failings to then thinking that vices don't involve any kind of skills. And I try to show that several kind of, important vices have certain skills indexed to them. So one of which would be what Kassam called epistemic insouciance, or kind of a lack of care for the truth, kind of an indifference to the truth. And this one way of kind of manifesting like this indifference to the truth is by bullshitting. And Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, has this kind of a very neat account of bullshit as a philosophical term, and where you aren't concerned about whether what you say is kind of grounded in the truth. Rather, your intentions are to kind of mislead others about your intentions. You try to deceive people about what you're really up to. I think that we're quite familiar with skilled bullshitters, people who are good at bullshitting. We think of politicians, people who know how to say the right things without actually really caring about the content of what they say. So that's an example there. Another one is we find this in cases from agnotology in sociology. So agnotology is the study of ignorance, and a key case would be corporations like ExxonMobil or BP suppressing evidence, obfuscating evidence about the effects of climate change and research on climate change. So people can be quite good at hiding evidence, suppressing evidence, and that would be perhaps a way of manifesting intellectual dishonesty, or other related traits. So as I mentioned earlier, virtues and vices have these four characteristics, one of which is this kind of behavioral or competence component. And I argue really that there are some important vices also kind of mirror the structure. They have a kind of behavioral or competence or skill component. So one way of manifesting them is through the kind of these skills that are distinctly attached to the vices in question. So that's what the vice index skill is.
Can you give us an example of such skill?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, bullshitting, being a skilled bullshitter, or bullshitting in general is typically thought to be a way of kind of manifesting this kind of indifference to the truth. So if you can cultivate if you can be a skilled bullshitter, you know how to kind of play off certain words, kind of know how to speak to your audiences and know what to say to people, but you don't really care about whether what you say is actually really grounded in any truth or evidence. That would be a kind of vice index skill. It's kind of big skill of bullshitting. Yeah.
That's a good example. You also, this is close, we're close to the end, don't worry. But you mentioned Kierkegaard and a leap of faith. There's the story of, who was it? Not Isaac, Abraham. And God telling him to sacrifice your son. I think his son is Isaac. And so I remember being told this story, and it kind of stuck with me. So how do you implement the idea of a leap of faith into what you're doing with the Ethics of Doubt project?
Yeah, so the first thing really, so the leap of faith is not actually a term that Kierkegaard uses. It seems to be something that kind of sprung into kind of just popular use, like a leap of faith. But he doesn't speak of the leap of faith as such. He just talks of the leap, which is it's quite hard to describe. I mean, I'm not really a Kierkegaard scholar, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask. But the story of Abraham, I think, comes from, well, I mean, it's used by Kierkegaard, and I think fear and trembling. But its relationship to the project would be tied in connection to intellectual courage. So having the courage to take the leap, involving kind of uncertainty. So there's uncertainty in what you do. When the facts in the world can't really tell you anything more, you need to kind of take the decision into your own hands. And, there are multiple ways in which you might respond to the situation. You might think, it's quite risky. I'm uncertain how this might play out. So maybe I'll step back. So you make no attempt. But another way is to take the leap, and that might involve a kind of virtuous form of courage to just contemplate that and to put that into action and to kind of face the uncertainty in life when, for example, the evidence doesn't tell you whether there's something uncertainty around the evidence. So you take that leap, and you kind of embrace the uncertainty and the risks that come with it.
Interesting. Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't touched?
No, I would just suggest if people are interested in the project, you can find us online at theethicsofdoubt.org, where we put on lots of project related events. We put on 2 every year, usually a workshop and a big conference. So we have a workshop coming up in May at the University of Southampton on conspiracy theories, and then we have a bigger conference coming up in September on intellectual courage and skepticism. So I would encourage people to look at our website, look at the work we do. We're quite busy doing outreach work as well, writing articles for popular kind of magazines, newspapers, and doing things like this, podcasts to try to spread the word. So I would encourage people to look at our website, to register on our mailing list and to stay up to date with events, and to try and implement intellectual courage in their own lives, to try to not be afraid of uncertainty and take risk, face up to risks.
Yeah, I like the website in the description too. I wanted to ask you a couple of more everyday life questions for you towards the end. And one is, how do you feel philosophy influenced your everyday life?
I think it makes me think about just things we take for granted, like knowledge, like who you are, your personal identity. I think it makes you question things that you otherwise wouldn't. It makes you slow down. I think life can be quite fast paced, and I think it helps you to slow down and actually look at the subtleties of life. One thing I just want to mention is that my phone might die in a minute. So I'm worried.
Okay.
I'm worried that I'm worried that my phone is going to die. What should I do?
That's so good. What's the percentage you have on your phone?
2%.
Well, we're nearly done. Do you have a charger? We can close it earlier too and just go make an outro.
Let me grab my charger from the other room. So, be back
yeah, don't worry. Take your
Okay.
time. Yeah, sounds good. All right, perfect. Yeah, so I was curious if how philosophy has influenced your everyday life.
Yeah, I would say that the main thing is that it's allowed me to appreciate the subtleties of life. I'm generally quite a curious person. I do a lot of thinking. So it's made me think more about
mundane things like, do I exist? Is there an external world? You think about these questions that you would kind of ordinarily take for granted. It's allowed me to slow down, I think. Life is quite fast paced. So it allows you to kind of step back and question assumptions. It's also good for, when you're talking to people and you listen to people's arguments, it teaches you how to argue well. What is a good argument? So it allows you to identify, not only flaws in other people's arguments, but also teaches you how to construct better arguments when you're talking to people, trying to put forward different views. It's allowed me to meet some really great people as well, working across a range of areas in philosophy, and allowed me to travel. So it's had lots of benefits. And I've been doing some teaching as well, and it's been wonderful kind of talking to students about topics that I'm really interested in, and seeing that they're also really interested, and kind of just engaging in debates and discussions about various different things, from fake news to deepfakes to intellectual virtues and vices. So I think teaching is one of the things that's had a big impact on is just how I kind of engage with people.
Definitely. Teaching is amazing. I teach jiu-jitsu actually, which is a martial art.
Nice.
And it's a joy. Well, I wanted to thank you because we're just starting now with my co-host Finn, who's at work today. These podcasts with professors and intellectuals and experts in different fields. And so I really appreciate that you took the time to join us. And I really enjoyed the conversation. I also wonder how you found the whole experience today. How did you find our talk?
Yeah, it was nice. This is my first time kind of going on a podcast and talking about my work. I generally don't like talking about my own work. So it's been an experience to kind of share some of my work and research with somebody outside of the field, and to just try to explain things that I sometimes take for granted, and to reflect on my work that I've done so far. So I've enjoyed it.
Also, I'm glad, and I think your work is really interesting, and I think lots of people like to learn about academic work in general, from my understanding being in academia, and also being in areas where people are not really academic. And what I see is people sometimes just give up on it too early because perhaps they encounter a difficult word or something like that. And obviously there's a danger of oversimplifying things, and we should be careful of not oversimplifying things. But I think taking a slow approach, a funnel approach of explaining definitions and slowly getting into the work, I think makes it interesting for everyone, for people that perhaps are more experienced in a field, for people that are not as experienced because they don't get lost. My last question, I actually had a few more questions, but I'm not going to do them, but I might email you with a couple of questions on anti-risk virtue epistemology, because I didn't touch on that as much. But my last question...
I'm happy to talk more about that. I don't mind.
Oh, cool. So, well, since you're giving me the opportunity, I'll ask you about that then. Can you talk to us a little bit about what anti-risk virtue epistemology is? And perhaps a little bit on local skepticism. And I'm unfamiliar with these terms, but I'm trying to understand them.
Yeah, sure. So anti-risk virtue epistemology is this view that is defended by Duncan Pritchard. And I'll start with breaking it down into its main components. So on the one hand, there is a virtue epistemology.
And the virtue epistemologist thinks that to have knowledge, when we have knowledge, some kind of cognitive ability is involved. When we say that we know something, we imply that you've kind of succeeded in believing something true, as opposed to being lucky. In the same way that, for example, as I mentioned with kind of performances, when you shoot a bullseye and you hit, you're manifesting some ability. The idea here is that there's like an ability and conditional knowledge. So it can't just be the case that you're hypnotized and you kind of acquire some belief. That belief has to come through your own kind of cognitive agency, your own cognitive abilities, maybe, your perception, or your memory, or so on. And the idea is that these cognitive abilities are reliable. They're truth conducive. So things like, so reliable memory, reliable vision will count as these kind of cognitive abilities. So Duncan Pritchard starts with this idea of this ability, conditional knowledge, which most virtue epistemologists also subscribe to. But he thinks there's a big problem facing the virtue epistemologists. And in particular, he thinks that this family of views struggles in precisely those kind of cases that we mentioned earlier, these fake barn cases. So he thinks in those cases, the person who is going through this county, looking at all these, what they think are genuine barns, they seem to be exercising or manifesting their cognitive ability. When they look at the genuine barn, they're doing it with their own eyes. So in what sense, is there not an exercise of cognitive ability going on? Yet, Pritchard thinks we don't want to attribute knowledge to people in these kinds of cases, as we were discussing. So that leads him to conclude that these kind of virtue epistemologies that are premised solely on this kind of ability conditions, kind of relating to our cognitive abilities alone, he thinks that they must be supplemented with an additional condition. And in his earlier work, he favored an anti-luck condition. So the idea there is that this anti-luck condition is built out of a safety condition of knowledge, which roughly says that if you were to form a given belief on the same basis in some close possible world, so as a closely related scenario, you not too easily would you form a false belief. So, for example, go back to our barn case again. In that case, your belief would be unsafe because very easily could you look at a different barn, or you could look at the barn and your belief would turn out false. So this idea of safety, Pritchard thinks has to be necessary for knowledge. So he tacks it onto an anti-luck condition. And he's in more recent work, he's moved towards this anti-risk condition. So this just says that not too easily could you form false beliefs on the same basis in close possible worlds. So an anti-risk virtue epistemology says that what's necessary and sufficient for knowledge is that your cognitive abilities are involved. So you believe something on the basis of your reliable, truth-conducive cognitive faculties or so on. But your belief is also safe from error. So not too easily could you believe the same thing on the same basis, but your belief turn out false. So he tries to, his rationale is to try and accommodate these tricky cases in epistemology. And that's the kind of core idea of anti-risk virtue epistemology.
That's fascinating. So the last question I want to ask you is the same one I ask to everyone, is if you had to summarize your mission statement for your life in one sentence, what would that sentence be?
Gosh, what a good question.
You can take your time.
I think I might have to. be nice to people. I think, you know, being nice, being polite, being courteous gets you a long way in life. And it's easy nowadays to jump to conclusions and to jump on people. And I think being nice has, you know, it's a strong currency. I think it's something that, you know, people should try to do and try to be in life.
Thank you so much. So we're done. Thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Matthews. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. And hope you enjoyed it as well.
Oh, mate, I loved it. Thank you so much. I'm going to spend lots of time now editing. and I think a lot of my learning comes from editing it, because I'm going to be able to rehear everything you said. And then because I make chapters on individual, well, on every part of our podcast. So then I'm going to be learning more and more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And yeah.
No worries.
Have a good rest of your day.
No worries. Enjoy the rest of your day.
So much. Yes, I'll send you a link. Have a good day, man. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. See ya.